Ya.
Un minuto falta. Minuto 12 segundos.
Yeah.
Capaz que ahorita entra.
Yes.
Are you sharing the
Yes.
and you recording it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Clarito se lo escucha. ¿Está por ahí el Roger? ¿Está por ahí el Roger?
Está arriba con la Cassandra viendo la televisión.
Otra vez mañana la semana empieza.
Otra vez, pero
Otra vez levantarse tempranito a trabajar.
yo no.
Tú no. Y mañana va a ser medio raro porque va a haber desfile y todo. Yo no sé cómo voy a pasar.
Aquí ha habido desfiles el viernes y el sábado. No, el viernes. Ah, sí, el viernes.
Javier ha dicho que tiene vacación mañana y el
Martes, es que el martes es el feriado.
ya, ahí está.
Welcome back. You're watching Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Carl Lajara. We're going to segue from the continuing coverage that we have tracking Tropical Storm Debbie and head into some other international headlines that we have been following throughout this week. Looking here at some footage that we had from just yesterday on Saturday. Thousands of people rallied in the streets of Venezuela's capital, waving the national flag and singing the national anthem in support of an opposition candidate they believe won the presidential election by a landslide. Authorities have declared President Nicolás Maduro the winner of last Sunday's election, but have yet to produce voting tallies to prove he won. Maduro also urged his backers to attend his own Mother of All Marches rally later on that day in Caracas. I do want to bring into the conversation now to continue discussing all of these developments and what we have seen. Throughout this last week, we have Eduardo Gamera, an FIU professor. Eduardo, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I'd like you to start by talking to us about what we've seen throughout this last week. Officially 7 days since that election took place in Venezuela, we've seen such an outcry internationally, really, by the results of those elections. But are you surprised by what we've seen?
No, and frankly, I think most of the scenarios, including scenarios that we did, kind of projected this massive fraud. And this is, by the most extreme Latin American standards, this was one of the most egregious forms of fraud. And not only because of the way in which it was done, but the way in which the government has attempted to substantiate its victory, right? By essentially producing false results, and then in the end not producing the actual ballots, right, where people voted. And this is a system of electronic voting, so the ballots themselves are recorded, and these tallies are recorded and can be readily verified. What the government didn't realize is that the opposition, in fact, was able to download those. And so the opposition has the copies of about 80% of the tallies, and the government has yet to produce a single one of the actual tallies. So we have here a situation where the opposition now has recognition, even by the United States, by Panama, Costa Rica, several other countries in Latin America. And Maduro has the recognition of the usual suspects: Russia, China, Iran. So here, this is, I think, where the situation is. One story of fraud and one story by an opposition that was able to build a huge movement and actually win an election, but not obtain the official recognition that it merits.
I'm circling back to this footage. Once again, this is from just yesterday. This was the rally and the protest in which many Venezuelans turned out to, there on the podium, I do believe, speaking on top of this truck, speaking to the supporters there is the leader of that opposition, Maria Corina Machado. Her handpicked presidential candidate was Edmundo Gonzalez. He is the person that the U.S. as well as other countries have recognized as the true winner of this presidential election. But as you just mentioned, it is Nicolas Maduro who has declared himself the winner and so far has been crowned, so to speak, the president of Venezuela. Let's talk about what happens next then, because this sounds like a very divisive issue. This sounds like a very complicated situation. What can we see going forward? Are we going to see possibly just the end of this, or are there going to be more riots? What really can be done?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. The government of Maduro has essentially begun a crackdown of enormous proportions. There are over 1,200 prisoners already. We've seen on the streets how people are arrested and beaten, and most importantly, I think this repression is going to continue. He is now officially trying to even get Maria Corina Machado arrested, Edmundo Gonzalez, the elected president, elected. And so I think this is going to continue for a while. And largely, again, if you look at this from the perspective of how Washington sees it, Washington recognizes Edmundo Gonzalez as the president. And Moscow recognizes Maduro as the president. And I think in some measure, we have to kind of take this out of just simply looking at it as an internal Venezuelan matter and kind of put it in a geopolitical context. And so I think Maduro believes that he can outlast the opposition. He believes that he can basically survive this. After all, he's survived now that regime has survived about 25 years of sanctions. And so continuing with sanctions is not going to solve the problem. It's not going to force Maduro to resign. There are some voices that are calling for a new round of elections, but a new round of elections will probably just confirm that the opposition will win again. So from Maduro's point of view, I think it's moving toward the consolidation of a now even a much more rigid authoritarian regime, and trying to hope that that his support from Russia and China and Iran is enough to offset the pressures from the United States and its allies.
Okay, let's compare then the support that both of these different parties have right now. As you mentioned, Maduro has the support from Russia, China, and Edmundo Gonzalez has the support from the U.S. When we look at it in a geopolitical situation and an overview, as you were just mentioning, how do those two different sides kind of compare when it comes to what ultimately is going to happen in Venezuela and who ultimately is going to be president?
Well, one of the more difficult things about the system in Venezuela is that the winner of this electoral round is not going to be sworn in until January. So there's a 6-month period of transition, right? Now, you also have to understand that Maduro basically controls not only the electoral tribunal, he controls the Congress, he controls the judiciary, he controls the armed forces. So all of the real power contenders are in Maduro's hands. The opposition has no recourse but the streets, no recourse but really trying to get support from outside forces, trying to get support from other Latin American countries. The Organization of American States, for example, met this week and actually tried to vote, right, forcing the Maduro government to turn over the official tallies, right? But it was unable to get a majority. Only 17 countries voted in favor of trying to force Maduro to do this. So he still has support, in the hemisphere, small Caribbean nations, Nicaragua and Bolivia. So he was unable to secure even the support of the most important regional organization. So Maria Corina was. So what you have now is essentially an impasse that unfortunately, because he has the power, it's going to lead to increasing repression, and it's going to lead, I believe, at least for the foreseeable future, for a consolidation of this dictatorship.
think it's a difficult situation to continue to talk about because it seems that, you had mentioned that really all the opposition has is to take to the streets, like what we're seeing here in this video. Maduro, though, still controls basically all of these forces that would continue to keep him in power. So I guess really the question is that it?
Well, I guess in a sense it's taking off my analyst hat and sort of wishing that it weren't it. But I think it really signals something that is much more worrisome, because I think that this is in fact something that we've seen as a regional trend, right? A regional trend that, for example, there will be elections in Bolivia next year, right? And Bolivia is one of the countries that supports Maduro. And Bolivia has its own set of problems, and it will be going through an electoral process this year. And so this idea that you can in fact hold elections and then essentially stage a fraud, right? Because Maduro will continue in power and might even get himself, sworn in January, right? And then might even be president for the next 6 years if nobody can really push him out of power. So what it sends is this horrible message, and more than anything else, it also sends a message to the United States. All right, the United States has no levers really to force any kind of regime change, right? Or even regime behavior to change. We've used sanctions as the preferred instrument, and sanctions unfortunately don't work. Sanctions may produce a little bit of change around the edges, but they don't do the things that at the moment at least the opposition would like to see, which is Maduro out of power, or at least Maduro changing his behavior, right? Because, and I'll finish with this, because Maria Corina Machado has actually offered to negotiate, right? See, I think they realize that in the context like Venezuela, where about 4 million people voted for Maduro and about 6 million people voted for Mr. Gonzalez, this is a divided country. And unless both sides at some point come together, right, it's going to be impossible to govern Venezuela over the next 6 years, 10 years. And they've already had 25 years of absolute turmoil.
Maduro's regime has retained power for more than a decade over there in Venezuela. After these elections, are we going to see a ripple effect throughout Latin American countries, maybe spanning all the way up to North America, maybe felt around the world?
Well, as I was saying earlier, I think you have at least two countries, right, where this kind of behavior is either being emulated, or maybe even Maduro emulated behavior from Nicaragua, where another dictator, Daniel Ortega, essentially has done the same thing. He imprisoned all of the opposition, right, to prevent them from running. He jailed those who weren't he wasn't able to prohibit from running, and he's kicked out a number of people from the country, and that leads to something else. One of the probably most severe consequences that we've already felt from the situation in Venezuela is that over the course of the last decade, about 8 million people have left Venezuela. And most countries in the region, especially neighboring countries like Brazil and Colombia, right, who are governed by presidents of the left, are themselves fearful that the situation in Venezuela is going to spark this enormous wave of migrants, right? And of course, this affects us as well, right? As you know, immigration has become a major issue in our own elections, and Venezuelan immigration has basically swelled. I mean, when you think about it, there's probably now about 800,000 Venezuelans in the United States, and there's 1 million in Peru, there's 2 million in Colombia. So it's affected every single country. The breakdown in Venezuela has largely now influenced the entire hemisphere, and it's affected our own politics in the United States.
Eduardo, I do want to leave you with the final thought here, maybe final words as we close this discussion. What are you most looking out for within the next few weeks, the next few years? What do you have your eye on that you think we should also be looking out for as well?
Well, I think that it's extraordinarily important for the United States and Washington to remain engaged and to remain engaged in a way that promotes democracy and that promotes to a certain extent I should say trying to deal with the causes of the roots of why these regimes come into office and why we have these massive waves of immigration. Now, to do that, of course, you need to be fully engaged. I think that Washington is doing the right thing now by recognizing Edmundo Gonzalez's victory. That, I think, is a very significant first step. Now, beyond that, of course, I think this is going to take a long-term plan. Whoever wins the elections in November, right? It's not just simply a question of paying lip service to fighting communism or paying lip service to promoting economic development in the region. It's really engaging the region in a positive way. And unless we do so, we're going to have a lot of more Venezuelas popping up in the region.
Eduardo Gamera, a professor at Florida International University, we truly appreciate your time as we continue to talk about this story. I don't think it's something that we're going to stop talking about again. The unrest in Venezuela is palpable, as you've seen from some of the images that we brought you here today. So we look forward to speaking with you again as we continue to follow this story.
Me too. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you so much. We do want to step away for a quick commercial break. Before I do that, though,
I want to bring up this tweet.
Un poquito.
Un poquito, para eso nos ha hecho